Hi guys, I'm Jaea Mae A Ligutom and my partner is Jhoniel M. Pasencia. We are assigned to discuss IFRIC 2 entitled Member Shares in Cooperative Entities and Similar Instruments. In November 2004, the International Accounting Standards Board issued IFRIC 2, which is entitled Member Shares in Cooperative Entities and Similar Instruments. It was developed by the Interpretations Committee. Cooperative and other similar entities are formed by groups of persons to meet common economic or social needs. National laws typically define a cooperative as a society endeavoring to promote its members' economic advancement by way of a joint business operation or the principle of self-help. Members' interests in a cooperative are often characterized as members' shares, units, or the like, and are referred as member shares. IAS 32 establishes principles for the classification of financial instruments as financial liabilities or equity. In particular, those principles apply to the classification of putable instruments that allow the holder to put those instruments to the issuer for cash or another financial instrument. The application of those principles to member shares in cooperative entities and similar instruments is difficult. Some of the International Accounting Standards Board constituents have asked for help in understanding how the principles in IAS 32 apply to member shares and similar instruments that have certain features and the circumstances in which those features affect the classification as liabilities or equity. This interpretation applies to financial instruments within the scope of IAS 32, including financial instruments issued to members of cooperative entities that evidence the members' ownership interest in the entity. This interpretation does not apply to financial instruments that will or may be settled in the entity's own equity instruments. Many financial instruments, including member shares, have characteristics of equity, including voting rights and rights to participate in dividend distributions. Some financial instruments give the holder the right to request redemption for cash or another financial asset, but may include or be subject to limits on whether the financial instruments will be redeemed. How should those redemption terms be evaluated in determining whether the financial instruments should be classified as liabilities or equity? The interpretation's consensus. The contractual right of the holder of a financial instrument, including members' shares in cooperative entities, to request redemption does not in itself require the financial instrument to be classified as a financial liability. Rather, the entity must consider all the terms and conditions of the financial instrument in determining its classification as a liability or equity. Those terms and conditions include relevant local laws, regulations, and the entity's governing charter in effect at the date of classification, but not expected future amendments to those laws, regulations, or charter. Member shares that would be classified as equity if the members did not have a right to request redemption are equity if either of the conditions described in paragraph 7 and 8 is present, or the members' shares have all the features and meet the conditions in paragraph 16A and 16B or paragraph 16C and 16D of IAS 32. Demands deposits, including current accounts and deposit accounts, and similar contracts that arise when members act as customers are financial liabilities of the entity. Member shares are equity if the entity has an unconditional right to refuse redemption of the member shares. Local law, regulation, or the entity's governing charter can impose various types of prohibitions on the redemption of member shares. Example, unconditional prohibitions or prohibition based on liquidity criteria. If redemption is unconditionally prohibited by local law, regulation, or the entity's governing charter, member shares are equity. However, provisions in local law regulations or the entity's governing charter that prohibit redemption only if conditions such as liquidity constraints are met or are not met, thus do not result in member shares being equity. An unconditional prohibition may be absolute, in that all redemptions are prohibited. An unconditional prohibition may be partial, in that it prohibits redemption of members' shares if redemption would cause the number of member shares or amount of paid-in capital from member shares to fall below a specified level. Member shares in excess of the prohibition against redemption are liabilities, unless the entity has the unconditional right to refuse redemption as described in paragraph 7, or the members' shares have all the feature and meet the conditions in paragraph 16A and 16B or paragraph 16C and 16D of IAS 32. In some cases, the number of shares or the amount of paid-in capital subject to a redemption prohibition may change from the time to time, such as a change in the redemption prohibition leads to a transfer between financial liabilities and equity. So, that's all for my part, and the continuation will be reported by my partner, Mr. Jhoniel M. Pasencia. Thank you, guys.
For number 5, at initial recognition, the entity shall measure the financial liability for redemption at fair value. In the case of member shares with a redemption feature, the entity measures the fair value of the financial liability for redemption at no less than the maximum amount payable under the redemption provisions of its governing charter or applicable law discounted from the first date that the amount could be required to be paid. For number 6, as required by paragraph 35 of IAS 32, distributions to holders of equity instruments are recognized directly in equity. So interest, dividends, and other returns relating to the financial instruments classified as financial liabilities are expenses, regardless of whether those amounts paid are legally characterized as dividends, interest, or otherwise. Examples 1 and 2 are cases of unconditional right to refuse redemption. So here, the cases will help us to determine if the member shares are part of the equity or the liability. So example number 1, the entity's charter states that redemptions are made at the sole discretion of the entity. The charter does not provide further elaboration or limitation on that discretion. In its history, the entity has never refused to redeem members' shares, although the governing board has the right to do so. So here, the entity has the unconditional right to refuse redemptions, and the member shares are part of the equity. So IAS 32 establishes principles for classification that are based on the terms of the financial instrument, and notes that a history of or intention to make discretionary payments does not trigger liability classification. So therefore, based on the case, the member shares are part of the equity. For the number 2, the entity's charter states that redemptions are made at the sole discretion of the entity. So, however, the charter further states that approval of the redemption request is automatic unless the entity is unable to make payments without violating local regulations regarding liquidity or reserves. So here, it's opposite. So the entity does not have the unconditional right to refuse redemption, and the member shares are a financial liability. So the redemptions only, the restrictions described are based on the entity's ability to settle the liability. They restrict the redemptions only if the liquidity or reserve requirements are not met, and then only until such time as they are met. Hence, they do not, under the principles established in IS 32, result in the classification of a financial instrument as equity. Okay, let's proceed to example number 3, and this example lies on prohibitions against redemption. But before that, let me read to you the case. So, a cooperative entity has issued shares to its members at different dates and for different amounts in the past as follows. So, on January 1, 2001, 100 shares at 10 currency unit each for 1 million. On January 1, 2002, 100,000 shares at 20 each for 2 million. So, shares are redeemable on demand at the amount for which they were issued. The entity's charter states that cumulative redemptions cannot exceed 20% of the highest number of its members' shares ever outstanding. At December 31, 2002, the entity has 200,000 outstanding shares, which is the highest number of members' shares ever outstanding, and no shares have been redeemed in the past. On January 1, 2003, the entity amends its governing charter and increases the permitted level of cumulative redemptions to 25% of the highest number of its member shares ever outstanding. So now let us know how the members of shares classified as equity or liabilities were affected by the amendments of governing charter on January 1, 2003. So before the governing charter is amended, members' shares in excess of the prohibition against redemption are financial liabilities. Because these shares are redeemable on demand, the cooperative entity measures the fair value of such liabilities in accordance with paragraph 47 of IFRS 13, which states that the fair value of a financial liability with a demand feature is not less than the amount payable on demand. So on January 1, 2001, the maximum amount payable under the redemption provisions is 20,000 shares at 10 currency unit each. And now the entity classifies 200,000 as financial liability and 800,000 as an equity. However, there is a new issue of shares at 20 currency unit each on January 1, 2002. The maximum amount payable under the redemption provisions increases to 40,000 shares at 20 each. This requires the recognition of an additional liability of 600,000, and accordingly, the entity now classifies 800,000 as the financial liabilities and 2.2 million as an equity. So these examples are assumed. This example assumes that these amounts are not changed between January 1, 2001 and December 31, 2002. So here, after the governing charter is amended, and that is on January 1, 2003, following the change in its governing charter, the cooperative entity can now be required to redeem a maximum of 25% of its outstanding shares, or a maximum of 50,000 shares at 20 each. And accordingly, on January 1, 2003, the cooperative entity classifies as financial liabilities an amount of 1 million, being the maximum amount payable on demand. It therefore transfers on January 1, 2003 from equity to financial liabilities an amount of 200,000, leaving 2 million classified as an equity. This slide shows the comparison before and after the governing charter is amended. So this shows the summarization of the example number 3. Disclosure. When a change in the redemption prohibition leads to a transfer between the financial liabilities and equity, the entity shall disclose separately the amount, timing, and reason for the transfer. The effective date and transition requirements of this interpretation are the same as those for the IAS 32. An entity shall apply this interpretation for annual periods beginning on or after January 1, 2005. If an entity applies this interpretation for a period beginning before January 1, 2005, it shall disclose the fact. This interpretation shall be applied retrospectively. So that ends the discussion for IFRIC 2, member shares in cooperative entities and similar instruments. Hopefully you had learned and earned some basic knowledge about IFRIC interpretation too. I am Jhoniel M Pasencia with Jaea Mae Ligutom. We thank you for listening. Bye-bye.